Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our 31st Global Online Seminar in Biodiversity Informatics. Just before I introduce our speaker, I'll mention to you that our 32nd Global Online Seminar in Biodiversity Informatics. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our 31st Global Online mentioned. There's an audio problem. Sorry about that. Our 32nd Global Online Seminar in Biodiversity Informatics will be next month, early May. Octavio Rojas, and he'll be talking about the role of taxonomic units and taxonomic definition in ecological niche modeling. But for now, seminar number 31, we have Richard Pearson. Richard, I was proud to notice, had on his CV a couple years ago, he had been co-advised in his postdoc by me, and so I quickly put that on my CV because I was very proud of it. But more simply, Richard has been a longtime leader in this area of distributional ecology ever since his doctoral dissertation. And in fact, it came up in conversation the other day that I believe that he is pretty much the only person in this field to have used neural networks in inferring and estimating ecological niches of species. But more generally, he has been amongst the leaders of this field for a decade and a half now, and so he'll be talking about projecting future climate-based range shifts in species. So, Richard, thanks a million for accepting to give this talk, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Town. We're good to go. So it's a pleasure, of course. Thanks so much for the invitation. This is such a cool idea, such a neat initiative, these webinars. So thanks for having me try and play a part. So what I'm going to do is say a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in our group for a little while over the last 3 or 4 years, really focusing on some recent work and focusing on the work that we've been doing looking at predicting extinction risk under climate change. But what I want to do, and I'll show you, is kind of take you through some of the different, with a slight historic element to how we're seeing the field changing in terms of different ways to predict distributions under environmental change. So what I'll do, I'm in London, so I'll say good morning or good afternoon as fit, but let me share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work. Maybe Town could confirm that you're, or at least let me know if you're not now seeing the first of the slides. So this is from Town, really, basically send questions into one of those two routes that you're seeing there, the Gmail account or Town's Twitter account, and then I think that we'll try and leave some time at the end for discussion or questions. All right, so title from me in terms of going to cover estimating range shifts and extinction risk under future climate change. And just broad background in terms of, kind of why we're interested in these questions and what the theoretical framework here is. Ultimately, a lot of our research in this field and my work is focused on trying to estimate or understand the factors that determine species distributions. And here's a rather neat way of setting it out. We sometimes refer to as the BAM diagram. So this is something that Jorge Soberon and Town Peterson put forward a few years ago. and has been written up in more detail in the book that I'm showing there on the slide, Ecological Niches and Geographic Distributions. But this is essentially the idea that distributions of species, their spatial patterns, are driven by the abiotic environment, so factors like temperature and precipitation or soil type or soil pH, whatever it might be. The biotic environment, so interactions with other organisms, predator-prey relationships, symbiotic relationships and the like. And then movement, so how species are actually able to disperse through the landscape. So it's some combination of these different factors that tell us about species distributions, and what we're trying to often do is understand the different roles, particularly at different scales, of these different factors in influencing distributions and potential distributions of species as the environment changes. And of course, understanding these things has, that's the theory, but it has some real important applications, and I've just listed a few on this slide. I'm not going to go through them, but they're the kind of things that we work on in this field. So accelerating the discovery of populations and unknown species, conservation planning. If we know something about distributions, we can do better reserve selection and conservation planning, predicting species invasions, anticipating the spread of diseases. A lot of work that's been done on understanding evolutionary history, in particular the biogeography of speciation. So there are many different applications that this underlying theory and the kind of methods that I'm going to talk about are relevant to. But I'm going to focus, for the next few minutes for this presentation on the specific field of looking at impacts on climate change. So impacts of climate change on biodiversity, to narrow it down a little bit. And of course, just to put this broadly in the field of biodiversity informatics, the kind of burgeoning data sets that we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years in terms of web accessible distributed databases. There are, I think, more than 700 million occurrence records that are available now through GBIF. Also, advances in remote sensing. We're now able to get very fine resolution data across large spatial extents. And then GIS-based tools, things like ecological niche models, also known as species distribution models, that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So this is the backdrop. We've suddenly got these tools, we've got these data sets that are accessible, that we can start doing neat, fun things with. So I basically thought for today I'd try and cover 3 pieces of work that we've been working on recently and try and place them in the broader kind of context of what's going on in the field. So I'm going to talk firstly about Arctic vegetation and some of the associated climate feedbacks. Then I'm going to talk about extinction risk for amphibians and reptiles in North America, and then some very recent work looking at community level responses in a California grassland. And there are some citations up there that I'll give you full citations at the end to go away and if you like, read more. But the flow through these things relates back to what I was talking about in terms of the different factors that influence species distributions. So the first example that I will give is using a kind of classic species distribution modeling or ecological niche modeling approach that basically looks at the abiotic environment and how that influences species distributions. And then I'll build in for the second example, movement and demographics more generally, demographic processes. So the second example, we'll look at some models where we couple distribution models with demographic models. And then for the final part of this, I'm going to talk about how we're increasingly moving towards trying to actually model whole ecosystems and look at the biotic interactions between species as well. So very much, I've kind of taken these 3 case studies, if you like, these 3 examples by way of introducing the different techniques and modeling approaches that underlie those. So I really want to focus, sure, on some of the impacts of climate change, but really I want to use that as a mechanism for talking in this forum about the different modeling approaches. So what you're going to see is a progression through what we might term a kind of classic correlative or statistical species distribution model. Then for the second example, talking about coupling with demographic models, and then for the final example, how we can build in biotic interactions using network models. So very briefly, what do I mean by a species distribution modeling? Of course, those of us, who follow the biodiversity informatics field and this training curriculum are well acquainted with this. So I'll refer you back to some of the other talks that have been given. But just very briefly, essentially, this is if I can use a pointer, where we take what we know about the known distribution of a species. So these are occurrence records across Europe. This is for a twin flower. It's a subarctic woodland dwarf shrub. But essentially, that's not so important now. The important thing is this is telling us something about the distribution of the species. What we also know, bottom left, as we're looking at this slide, is something about the environment. So we know something about temperature, about precipitation, about soil type, about where rivers are, about what the slope is, what the aspect is, these kinds of factors. And then simply what we do conceptually is very simple. We're going to say that the probability of a species occurring is some function of these different environmental variables, the x's, if you like, in this kind of mock-up of an equation. Now, this equation, the actual form of this model can take many different forms. So in this field, we might use a generalized linear model, a general additive model, a maximum entropy approach, or any number of approaches that have been used. But essentially, conceptually, the approach is very straightforward. We take what we know about the distribution, what we know about the environment, and build a statistical relationship between the two. And then we can project that back onto the landscape and say, well, where in the landscape are the environments similar to where we've already found the species? And that's what you're seeing there with that kind of present day estimate of where the habitats, if you like, the environments are suitable for this species. Then, of course, once we've done that, we can do cool things like plug in some future climate scenarios. So in the model that we've built, we can tweak the climate, say warm the temperature up, cool the temperature down, change the precipitation, and then predict where those environments might be under some future scenarios, for example, those put out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's the essential approach behind species distribution modeling in a nutshell. So let's move on to just a little bit further north than my example there, and actually start on this first case study of looking at Arctic, what I'll term greening under recent climate change. So this is, by greening, we essentially mean it's a pattern it's a phenomenon that we're seeing through remote sensing data, through repeat photographs that you're seeing on this slide as well, where as the temperature is increasing, or has done over recent decades, photosynthetic activity in the Arctic is increasing, which is what we mean by greening. So you see this in this main part of the figure. This is from some remote sensing data, showing the green there is showing where this greening is occurring. So photosynthetic activity is increasing. And there's some neat work here showing Matthew Sturm and colleagues published a few years ago now, who repeated photographs. They got hold of some old photographs from the 1940s, repeated those in around the year 2000, and then statistically showed that shrubs were increasing in abundance across the Arctic, or at least this was in the North Slope of Alaska. So we see this pattern, and from a modeling perspective, this was of interest in particular because this is an environment where we know that the plants, we know that the distribution of shrubs and grasses and the like are very tightly linked to the environmental conditions, to the abiotic environment. So this was a good case study to start using some more simple distribution modeling type approaches where we're simply correlating, we're associating particular abiotic environments to particular vegetation types. So that's essentially what we did. It's a distribution modeling approach that was a little bit different. If you read the paper, I won't get bogged down in it now, but instead of associating an individual species with the climate conditions, we used a multi-class machine learning algorithm that enabled us to take 10 different classes that you see along the bottom there, conceptually, of 4 different classes of graminoids, so kind of grasses, and then smaller prostrate shrubs, larger erect shrubs, and then 2 different classes of trees, we basically associated those with environmental conditions, with temperature and precipitation data. So what you see on the left here is the present day, what the distribution of those different vegetation classes is throughout. We did this across the whole of the Arctic, but this is just focusing in on mostly on Siberia. And then again, we build the statistical relationship between the vegetation distributions and the environment, and then we can project those under different future scenarios. And we've done that over a whole bunch of different scenarios, taking into account different niche modeling approaches, so different algorithms, different general circulation models, so different climate models, different emission scenarios, different dispersal abilities. So we basically take into account as many uncertainties as we can, and then use the models to project under those different kinds of scenarios. So what you're seeing here is actually a very extreme example. It's the most extreme example that we generated, where we allowed species to disperse a long way, and it was a fairly severe climate scenario. So it gives a good visual impression, but I'm presenting it, as a kind of extreme version. But overall, the models were predicting that at least half of the vegetated areas will shift to different physiognomic classes under different future climate scenarios. So essentially, the message was that there's potential for a really quite massive redistribution of these vegetation classes under future scenarios. So that's just to give you one impression of the results spatially. Another thing that we did, and you can do, is look at the percentage change in area. So this is a plot. We've got just 8 of the different classes are on this plot. Percentage change in area. So essentially anything above the 0 line, as we're looking at it, is going to be an increase in the distribution of that class of vegetation types. So what we're predicting, well, sorry, I should emphasize the width of these bars is then taking into account all those kinds of uncertainties that I mentioned in terms of different dispersal abilities, different emission scenarios, different modeling algorithms that we used. So the width is a kind of measure of uncertainty. But you begin to pick out some very clear patterns here. So within these graminoid tundras, for example, G3 are bigger than G2. They're more dense, larger graminoids that are bigger than G1. Similarly, with the prostrate shrubs, it's the larger shrubs that are P2 and the smaller shrubs that are P1. So what we see is this general trend towards the larger physiognomic classes are those that are benefiting from climate change, and it's the smaller ones that are losing out. But we're able to actually quantify this, and some patterns come out, such as G4 is an interesting case that seems to buck the trend. But when you look at this spatially, it's because there isn't actually anywhere for that class to disperse. This is a class that's restricted to some areas of Siberia and Alaska, where they really don't have any land poleward to migrate to under future scenarios. But essentially, we're seeing this kind of predictions that going forward in time, again, it's going to be more and more greening. But what we're able to do is quantify, in terms of area, the amount of change that we would expect to see for each of these classes. So we put this out. This was a paper that was published in Nature Climate Change. It got a little bit of media attention. I just throw this in as a bit of an aside, really, but it was quite interesting. Some of the coverage that we got, we weren't predicting this. We weren't predicting polar bears with suddenly around palm trees. Our predictions were much more subtle, but there was an interesting story here in terms of how you publish the paper and then it gets out into the media and sometimes takes on a life of its own, which is something a few of us are interested in and something that I've written about, chapter 9 in this book. So it's an interesting just aside, basically, of what happens to the research once you publish it. But we weren't predicting quite something so extreme. It was a little bit more boring than that, really. We were predicting more areas like this, less bare ground, more growth of shrubs, more growth of larger classes of graminoids. And I'll only go over this briefly, but one of the backdrops to what we were trying to do was look at feedbacks with the climate system. In particular, to try and quantify, based on the changes in area that we were predicting, we were trying to quantify the different feedbacks to the climate system. And we did that. It's obviously written up in more detail. I'm going to just go over the methods very briefly now. We did that using some remote sensing data where we could, based on a change in area, actually quantify the radiative forcing, so the watts per meter squared of these different feedbacks. So, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty in the literature as to which of these feedbacks are more important. So what we wanted to do is just try to get a handle on which was looking like it was having the biggest influence. So change in albedo is one of the classic responses. We refer to this as a positive feedback insofar as you get more shrubs, so warming creates more shrubs, which lowers albedo. That means that there's less of the radiative, there's less reflection of the sun's radiation back into the atmosphere. More of the sun's radiation is soaked up, if you like. So more radiation is absorbed by the planet, which leads to more warming, which leads to more shrubs, which leads to more radiation being absorbed, etc. So you get this positive feedback. And we were able to quantify that with big error margins, but we could nonetheless quantify it. Another feedback is then ET here, meaning evapotranspiration. So this is another positive feedback. The more shrubs that you have, the more evapotranspiration you expect to have, which means more water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor, of course, is a greenhouse gas. So you'd expect to get more warming. Again, more warming, more shrubs, more evapotranspiration, etc. And we were able to, again, quantify that based on this remote sensing data and these ecological models that we generated. And similarly with biomass, you're getting the picture, but this would be a negative feedback. So the more shrubs that you have, the more carbon is stored in biomass, which means less carbon in the atmosphere, which means more cooling, and so on. So it would be a negative feedback. And the big picture here was that we were finding that the results show that the vegetation, like the distribution shifts, will overall result in a positive feedback because it's this decrease in albedo that is the driver. So that was a background context. We were able to use these kinds of ecological models to build in information that's now we think of use for building Earth system process models where we're actually trying to quantify these different kinds of feedbacks. But this was all based on the kind of biodiversity informatics approaches that we're interested in. Of more direct relevance to what I wanted to focus on today is how we can interpret this in terms of extinction risk. So, of course, you know, I've just talked about shrubs in the Arctic, but they're part of a very complex food web with unique biodiversity. And I've given you some pictures on this slide of the kinds of critters that I'm referring to. So you'd expect that as some of these vegetation classes are changing, you'd expect that to have knock-on impacts up through the ecological systems. So again, if we go back to our percent change in area, a classic way of interpreting this kind of result is to say, well, let's say that for those classes that are shrinking, they're predicted to shrink in area into the future, plug that into a classic species area relationship, one of the few kinds of laws of nature that we have in ecology, where the larger area you have, the more species you will support. And similarly, the smaller a shrinkage in area will result in less species. We can infer from that an extinction risk. For those classes, those species that are restricted to these classes that are expected to contract, we can expect a higher extinction risk. And that's the general principle that's been quite widely applied over the last decade or even 15 years in this field. A very famous paper by Chris Thomas and colleagues that was front page of Nature back in 2004 is a classic example of that. And this kind of work then, in terms of using these models to predict extinction risk, has been very influential from a policy perspective. So here's just a quote from the IPCC's fifth assessment report back in 2014, that a large fraction of terrestrial and freshwater species face increased extinction risk under climate change. So this kind of result that lands on policymakers' desks is not exclusively, but in large part has been driven by these kinds of methods that we're interested in and that I'm talking you through today. So that's kind of distribution modeling, a brief few minutes on just distribution modeling per se. Let me move on to the second case study now, where I'm going to talk about coupling these SDMs with demographic models. So the question essentially then is, can we improve predictions of extinction risk? There's been a lot written for good reason, that a lot of the uncertainty, a lot of the predictions that have been put out and been influential are highly uncertain. The kind of models that are put out, and here's just a figure repeating, the classic distribution modeling approach. This kind of approach, it's a statistical method. It doesn't take into account aspects of species biology, things like population dynamics and dispersal. It's a very statistical, non-kind of mechanistic approach. So that, of course, raises many uncertainties. So one of the things that we and others have been interested in doing is to try and couple a distribution model with a demographic model. So this is our classic distribution model, as I've just talked through. Build a statistical relationship between where the species occurs and what the environment is. Then what we're going to do is make an assumption, and it is a big assumption that we could discuss at length, that tells us something about habitat suitability or even carrying capacity. So in a particular cell, if there's a high probability that the species will occur there, we're going to interpret that as saying that the habitat is more suitable and that there's a higher carrying capacity. So what we've been doing is feeding these kinds of outputs into a classic demographic model, kind of population viability analysis. So this is a more mechanistic approach where we take into account factors such as generation length, growth rates, dispersal ability, that's key, fecundity, and actually model the population dynamics. So births occur, populations grow, they send off propagules to disperse to populate new areas that set up new populations, some populations go extinct, etc. And we can actually use well-established methods to model these population dynamics on top of the dynamic habitat suitabilities that are coming out of the distribution models. So we have this system where the landscape is changing, the habitat is changing as predicted by a distribution model, and on top of that, we're actually modeling the mechanics of population dynamics. The key thing here then is that we're able to actually model abundance. We're not just modeling habitat suitability, we're saying what's the likelihood, or what's the probability of a given cell in the landscape having a certain abundance of species. And if we know something about abundance, we can actually predict extinction risk. So now, instead of trying to infer extinction risk from simply saying that, well, the habitat suitability is shrinking, less area means less species, we're actually, for individual species, trying to predict, trying to estimate really properly what the extinction risk is based on the probability of declining by a given amount, but the abundance declining by a given amount. So let me just put that, if you like, in action. And notice, if I just flag back, there are references here that you can follow up. So the methods here were written up in a paper that David Keith led that was published back in 2008, conceptually what we're trying to do here. Let me then move on to our kind of case study application of these methods. I'm going to go through this quickly. It's written up in the gory detail in a paper, but essentially we took a bunch of endemic amphibians and reptiles in the United States. We settled on 36 species. These are very much more computationally and data intensive, or they require a lot more data than just a pure distribution models where you just need distributions. So we just restricted ourselves to 36 amphibians and reptiles. We worked with 2 climate scenarios. A key thing here was we put a lot of effort into generating annual time steps. Instead of just predicting, say, to 2050s or to the 2080s, we actually wanted to, or we needed to, have annual time steps so that we could model a process, particularly of dispersal, as these organisms are going to move through and exist in the landscape under future scenarios. So we put out and have made scenarios with annual time steps available. We generated distribution models using Maxent, could have used any number of methods, but that's what we did in this particular study. And then the demographic models, which are particularly run by Rashid Ashikaya's group at Stony Brook University. These were, we divided our species into 6 different life history types that are listed there. We use stage-structured density-dependent stochastic models implemented within RAMAS, the tool RAMAS, and it ended up with us generating nearly 10,000 generic, these life history models, where we're not trying to predict a particular parameter, such as a birth rate, a death rate, or a dispersal ability. We're basically saying what's the minimum and maximum that's likely for a given life history type, say for a turtle or a tortoise, and then using a method to subsample within those bounds, within the upper and lower bounds. I won't go into any more detail on the method there. I'm trying to give you the broad picture. But what we were able to do then is to run these models. We run the distribution models with the demographic models on top and draw this kind of conclusion. So these are the mean extinction risks for those 36 species of amphibians and reptiles in North America, things like box turtles, blunt-nosed leopard lizards, where this now is actually a prediction of extinction risk. This isn't inferred from shifting or from contractions of climate space. This is a real prediction of extinction risk. Sure, with a number of uncertainties, but we think biologically it's a bit closer to what we're really after than a distribution model on its own. So we're predicting under no change climate scenario, under a policy scenario. So this is a kind of optimistic 450 parts per million greenhouse gas concentration, CO2 concentration over the coming 50 years or so. Actually, this is up to 2100. And then a more pessimistic reference scenario. This is more, if you like, business as usual scenario. And we're predicting pronounced increases in extinction risk under the coming century, anything from broadly 25 to 30% risk of extinction across this group over the next century. So fairly major extinction risk. And it's interesting to note that the extinction risk is high even under the kind of policy scenario, the more optimistic scenario, kind of showing that conservation actions that incorporate climate adaptation are going to be necessary to reduce extinctions, regardless of whether mitigation strategies are implemented. So this difference here between the policy and reference was kind of less than we hypothesized it might have been. But we really wanted to do a lot more than that with this particular study and this set of tools that we've been developing. We wanted to kind of move away, and I think this is a general feeling in the field, that there's a need to move away from just trying to quantify, if you like, how many species will go extinct due to climate change, and instead move toward informing applied conservation planning by kind of understanding the traits that make species more vulnerable. So it's not just about predicting what the percentage of species are that are going to go extinct or increased risk of extinction. It's about trying to more mechanistically understand what the traits are that define vulnerability to climate change. So we wanted to ask here, is the IUCN Red List adequate for identifying species that are vulnerable to climate change? And this is building on a growing literature that's essentially saying, you know, the Red List was put together, the criteria for red listing species were developed before climate change was really a key player as a threat to biodiversity. And we need to rethink how that red list works. So we wanted to ask that question, well, do the criteria that are used to assign the species on the red list and to different categories, do they actually enable us to capture the threat of climate change, or do we need to completely rethink the criteria that are used to red list species within the IUCN framework? And we could do this using these kind of coupled SDM demographic models because they have a more they allow us to have a more mechanistic understanding of the traits and incorporate key processes such as dispersal, life, birth rates, death rates, you know, vital rates, and the like. So we wanted to ask this question, and what we basically did was undertake a massive sensitivity analysis of these models. So we were running all these different trajectories in terms of predicting under annual time slices what might happen to populations of species. We ended up running about 10 million replicates, different time slice, different timelines from present day to 2100, and tried to identify from those the traits that are associated with extinction risk, specifically due to climate change. So we basically vary the parameters within the model and try to understand when we vary which parameters, which are those parameters that give us higher risk of extinction. And then we can draw a nice figure like this that basically tries to rank them, rank which of the variables that are more important. And you know, this is just for 36 species, or you know, just a few amphibians and reptiles in North America. So quite how generalizable this is up for debate. But methodologically, this is something we're able to do. And what we found was that most of those variables that we found to be important, things like occupied area, population size, generation length, they're already used in classic conservation assessments such as the red list. So we kind of concluded that that supports or indicates that current systems might be better able to identify species vulnerability to climate change than some people have been thinking. So a next step in this was to ask, really, are conservation methods, how useful are they? And specifically, can the IUCN's red list provide advanced warning of extinction risk due to climate change? So if we accept that we don't need to throw the method out, we can use the red list criteria in the methods. We wanted to ask, can they give us enough advanced warning of extinction risk due to climate change? And here's just one neat way of kind of framing this and thinking about this. If we say that this is our population size going forward in time, and the black line here is our just hypothetical trajectory of what might be happening to that population, but in this case eventually goes extinct, then this warning time that we get between a species being listed as threatened, that's when it kind of we do an assessment and it meets one of the criteria under such as the red list assessment methods. When it's actually red listed, we're going to say that, well, there's some latency time until conservation action will begin, then we'd like to think that there's some response time before recovery begins. And what we're asking is, well, can these methods give us enough warning time between listing a species as threatened and changing the trajectory, this dashed line here, that means that the species doesn't actually go extinct, that we can actually induce recovery. So what we did from this big sensitivity analysis that I've just mentioned, what we did was take all of those trajectories that actually resulted in an estimate of extinction. We had about 4,000 of them, more than 4,000 of them, and plotted this kind of, asked basically how many years were they listed before they went extinct. So we applied the IUCN red listing criteria to these modeled extinction trajectories going forward, and asked for, from the point where we actually would say that they become listed as vulnerable or critically endangered, anything more than vulnerable, when they click that criteria, when that's met, how long before they actually went extinct. So that's what we're seeing across these 4,000 or so. It's a histogram showing the distribution of those trajectories. And it's kind of encouraging that there's only about 1% of the trajectories had less than 20 years between becoming red listed and actually going extinct. The median is shown by this black triangle here at around 60 years. So for most species, we were getting quite a long warning time before the species would actually go extinct. So that was kind of encouraging. But moving on from that, what we also did, and this is a paper that Jessica Stanton led, it's in Global Change Biology in 2015, you'll see the citation there. We wanted to, basically when you do this kind of red listing, what we'd done in the previous slide was assume that, well, we've got perfect data and we can red list according to any of the IUCN categories, so that the IUCN has different red listing categories based on things like population reduction, geographic ranges, population sizes. We assumed that we had the data to use any of those criteria. So when one of those criteria were met, we red listed them, hypothetically, within our analyses. But in reality, we know that the vast majority of species have very poor data. Of course, within biodiversity informatics, we're trying to accelerate the data that are available, but we often have very, very restricted data. So what we then did was basically ask, well, suppose we can only red list based on one of these criterion. We only have enough data to red list based on one of these criterion. And then you'll see that the story gets much more pessimistic. So these kind of background histograms here are what we were finding when we could red list based on all of the criteria. But then when we only red list based on, say, criterion A about population reductions, it shifted dramatically, and actually more than 50% of species were getting less than 20 years that they were continuously listed as threatened before they actually went extinct. So this really emphasizes the need for improved data. We're arguing that we don't necessarily need completely new assessment methods. The assessment methods that we have seem to, in principle, be doing the job or capable of picking up the traits and the trends that lead to extinction. But we need improved data, which is, of course, why the whole field of biodiversity informatics is really quite key. All right, let me move on to my third case study, which is going to focus on a California grassland. And this is where we're actually going to try to build in biotic interactions. So hopefully you're seeing this progression from the abiotic environment through the abiotic environment combined with dispersal and demographic processes. The real thing that we've been working on, and as of others, has been a big issue in the field for years now, is everything that I've presented so far, and the vast majority of work in the field is based on estimating a single species, how it responds to the environment. We might do that for lots and lots of species, but still we're asking, how does an individual species respond to the environment? And of course, we know that species respond to not just the abiotic environment, but they respond to the biotic environment. They're all part of communities. So what we wanted to do, and what, as I say, we've been working on for a long time, is to try and develop some techniques that allow us to incorporate these kind of community level responses and incorporate biotic interactions. And just as of very, very recently, we've got a paper in press that sets out some ideas as to how we can start doing this. And that's I'll emphasize, it's the title of the paper that's coming out, and pictures here of the key people that have been working on this: Philip Stanchenko, Prabhu Suga, and Blake Suttle. Blake, you'll see, is really the powerhouse behind the grassland case study that we were using, and Philip has been with Prabhu leading the Bayesian network analyses that we've been using from a computational perspective. So one of the kind of background elements here is that we're interested in kind of linking macroecology and community ecology. So one thing that a number of us are interested in is how different factors affect distributions at different spatial scales. So there's a lot of theory out there and a lot of talk and discussion about how some distributional elements seem to be influenced mostly by abiotic factors such as temperature, frost days, precipitation at large spatial scales, large extents, coarse resolutions. And then at much finer spatial resolutions and smaller areas, we tend to find that biotic interactions become very increasingly important. So a good way of thinking about this is in terms of predictions or understanding impacts of climate change. So to take a classic example, Blake Suttle, who I've just mentioned, who's been working with us on this, has been working with a grassland system in California for I don't know, more than, it's about 15, 18 years or so now. And this is community ecology. These are local scale plots that you're seeing, the circles on the photo that's there. He's been studying how within those very local scale plots, the communities have been changing as he's been changing different precipitation regimes. And his, as captured in the title here, his overarching what he's been finding, and this is not just his work but across many different studies, is that interactions between species are really driving the responses to climate change. Whereas if you think conceptually of what we tend to see happening at large spatial scales, think of, say, Neil Parmesan's work with butterflies in North America and other studies showing poleward distribution shifts. We tend to take, a distribution of a species, such as I'm conceptually showing in grey here, and then under a future scenario, that distribution will shift poleward. So at a macro scale, in terms of the macro ecology, we tend to be seeing these kind of large-scale, simple patterns that emerge. Distributions are shifting poleward. And yet at the very fine spatial scales, it seems a lot more complex than that. So we're kind of interested in trying to understand how these simple large-scale patterns emerge from this much more complex local behavior. So we've been pulling on board some methods from other fields, particularly work looking at networks. So here's just some ideas of, looking at protein-protein interactions in humans, or maps of the internet, social networks. There's a lot of work that's been done on trying to explore and understand these kind of complex systems, networks as complex systems. So we've been trying to pull in some of these methods, particularly working with Filip Stanyczenko, into what we're doing, and ask how these networks might help us to improve predictions of distributions and extinction risk and the like. So this is an interaction network that we put together for this grassland community in California. I'll skip some of the details in terms of how we kind of built this particular network, but essentially we used macroecological data to identify the interactions that gave improved predictions of present day ranges, and then we compared those, we informed those predictions using the community ecology data that Blake has from his particular case study. But essentially, there are a number of ways that you can get to this kind of interaction network, but this was what we were working with. So what you see are 14 focal species that we concentrated on because we had good occurrence data for, and then around the edge are these numbers just refer to different species. And then we have these conditional dependencies where a species will be influencing another species. And you'll see that there are chains of influence that kind of occur across this kind of network. So we develop some sort of network of ecological interactions, conditional dependencies across our system. And then what we basically do within a kind of Bayesian framework is, well, we take our distribution model, we use Maxent, but it could be any SDM, to generate our prior probabilities. So everything that I've said so far, we can think about as being prior probabilities, prior insofar as there's no network interactions taken into account. Then what we do is throw those prior probabilities, their individual species predictions, so we get a probability for each of these species in our network, we put it into a network. We use Bayesian networks to solve this. And then those probabilities can, if you like, bounce around. So higher probability might influence another species, might make it go up, that probability go up or down, which in turn might have a knock-on impact on another species, etc. And through that, we can generate posterior probabilities, which are the probabilities that are adjusted, taking into account the distributions or the probabilities of each of the other species. So we're modeling, using a distribution model, the abiotic environment for individual species, and then we're throwing this through a network interactions model to get out probabilities that take into account these kinds of interactions. And broadly speaking, here's one result. This is based on Monte Carlo cross-validation with present-day data, so no future predictions here. For our 14 focal species, we're modeling the difference in AUC, that's the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve. It's a measure of how good our model is, how good our prediction of the distribution is, the posterior minus the prior. So the difference between the model with and without the biotic interaction network. So anything above this 0, 0 red line is an improvement in model performance. And as you'll see, you know, on the whole, we're able to show that by including the biotic interactions, by including the Bayesian network, we're able to make better predictions of present-day distributions. And then it's not so much the focus of our paper, but it's something that we mention as something that we're really there's a lot of analyses in there, but it's not the focus. But it's one of the areas that we really want to explore in the future. You know, we build the models, we parameterize the networks. We can do exactly the same with future scenarios. So we can predict under future climate changes. So this is just one example, taking one species, small-headed clover. It's an annual nitrogen fixer within this system. So the SDM with biotic interactions is predicting a larger relative decrease in geographic area than an SDM without biotic interactions. So we can kind of interpret that in terms of extinction risk, that essentially including the biotic interactions in the model leads to a higher estimate of extinction risk. So when you include the biotic interaction, we were getting a reduction in area of about 65%, a little bit less without biotic interactions. So that's just to illustrate the kinds of things that we're interested in exploring. When we incorporate biotic interactions, you know, we can start looking at these kinds of questions as to how that influences predictions of extinction risk. So just to wrap up, most often for this case study, we were finding that including biotic interactions reduced estimates of extinction risk under climate change, but I don't want to generalize too much from that. This is just from a few, you know, case study examples of trying to get the methods to work and demonstrate the methods. And one thing that we are interested in doing, and hope others will be doing as well, is testing across a larger sample of species in different communities, how incorporating biotic interactions changes predictions in different cases, be it under climate change, measuring extinction risk and the like. So at least we would like to say that this Bayesian networks approach, it holds promise for getting over this fairly big hurdle that we've had in the field for including biotic interactions in models of species distributions. So let me just wrap up now, just to say, you know, I tried to present the theory in terms of these different factors using the BAM diagram, and then a series of case studies where I tried to show somewhat how the field is developing, but it's not just a time element here. The different models are useful for doing different things. So progression through the distribution models that are just a abiotic environment, usually coupling with demographic models that incorporate movement and demographic processes, and then what we're interested in terms of trying to incorporate biotic interactions. And then just finally, of course, they're the full citations for the key things that I focused on, and I must acknowledge, of course, the people that have really pushed this forward, particularly, well, I shouldn't single people out because everyone's been important, but Rashid Ashokaya, Philip Stanek-Zenko, Blake Suttle, Scott Getz, and others. So I will finish there and hopefully be able to pass back to you, Town. And of course, please send in questions if you haven't done already.
Thanks, Richard.
Well, I'm glad to hear you there.
Yeah, I'm here. Don't worry.
Not talking to myself.
Yeah, we're over our audio problems of earlier. Everybody who is listening from elsewhere, please do send in your questions either to the email address or the Twitter account that Richard had up. That will allow Richard to respond to any questions and thoughts that you have. Richard, I'll pass on one question to you from somebody who is here in the room. Daniel from Puebla is asking, what do you think about, or what is your group doing as far as model selection? There's quite a number of papers using AIC and other criteria like that. But what do you see as the relationship between model selection and then model transfers?
What do you mean by model transfers?
Sorry, projection to future climate or to another continent.
Yes, big question and quite controversial in the field in terms of, we've shown, as others have, just how different predictions from different models can be, just from different SDMs can be. Broadly falls into two camps in terms of where we should be using consensus type approaches, where we use lots of different methods and then look at averages or consistency across those different methods, versus those who would argue that we should be focusing on a smaller, fewer number of species that, of models that we believe perform best, however we select those, which is the best model. I sit in both camps, probably, if that isn't too much of a cop-out. I think that there are, in terms of making good predictions, there are some good reasons why consensus methods can be useful. So we don't select a particular method, but we model across lots of different algorithms and then try and use that suite of models to make predictions. But I'm also very supportive of analyses that focus in on one or two models that, based on some criteria related to the AIC, whatever it might be, related to the particular application. If someone's, and we've done it in some of the work I've presented, we've just used maxent or some other method. We believe that that was the best method for that particular application. We can parameterize the models really well. We understand how they're working, rather than kind of throw the kitchen sink at it and have lots of different black boxes. We actually use the model that we understand best and understand and can parameterize best. So we would, in many cases, and when we're reviewing and editing papers and that, see justification for actually just running with one or two best models based on some criteria. I think that both are important and perfectly valid. It's certainly not the case that, oh, you have to be running kind of consensus methods or it's not, not defendable. Is that roughly, hopefully, on topic?
Very much so, thanks. And then I'm going to ask a question as well. A few years ago, you and I and 5 other colleagues published a book that that pushed the idea that we termed the Eltonian noise hypothesis. You mentioned at the end of your third part that we need a lot more species assessed as far as the effects of biotic interactions. But what do you think? Are we going to see the demise of the Eltonian noise hypothesis, or is that still something that applies to a lot of species, if not all?
I don't see the demise of it as yet. I think we have to be open-minded, of course, but I certainly think that there's ground in this general idea that abiotic factors, broadly speaking, are influencing broad scale, as in large extent, coarse resolution patterns, and then biotic interactions are influencing patterns of distribution at a finer spatial scale. I think that there's plenty of ground in terms of trying to understand that, and really we refer to it in this new paper that we're putting out. And really what we're trying to do is set up the kind of methods that will allow us to test that. And I think hopefully when this paper's out, people will agree that we've gone some way, as others have, but gone some way to actually developing a framework that we can very specifically go after that question. So I'd like to think that there's a lot of work still to be done, and we've made a step forward with being able to really tackle that.
Interesting. Thank you. I have a question in from Angela Cuervo in Mexico. And she asks, IUCN is assessing species response to climate change with a combination of sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and I think she means exposure variables. She cites a paper by Foden et al. 2013 and PLOS One, where the first two, so sensitivity and adaptive capacity, are collected via workshops with experts, and exposure is measured as the differences between present and future temperature and precipitation, I assume across the range of the species. What is your opinion of this type of assessment?
Yeah, good question and a biggie. So yeah, Wendy Foden and colleagues have put out some really good work, as was just described. I'll refer you as well to, if you haven't seen it, a really nice paper that Michela Pacifici put out, a review in Nature Climate Change. I think it was published last year, it might have been the year before, that reviews some of these things. But essentially what I think has happened in this field over the last decade now, really, is almost parallel approaches. There's the what has just been characterized, and it's a caricature, but the kind of approach that Wendy Foden took to start with of getting experts sat down in a room, holding workshops for particular taxonomic groups to try to define the traits that make species more or less vulnerable to change, versus the slightly more techie, if you like, data-driven, biodiversity informatics-driven approaches that I and others have been working on, and which Ashikaya has been pushing, which is much more data-driven, but to try to get at a similar question, you know, as I presented, what are the traits that make species more or less vulnerable? And I think what's kind of happening, and what's happening through the IUCN's climate change specialist group that myself, Rashid, Wendy Foden and others are a part of, is to try to bring these two different strands together and look at commonalities. So I certainly don't think that one is the right way to go forward. One method, one approach is the right way to go forward. We need to be using expert opinion. We need to be crunching data as well, as best we can, to try and get at these fundamental questions. They're parallel approaches, and what we need to do is pull them together better. Quite how that's done is still up in the air, and there's being a lot written about different assessment frameworks. But it's definitely, you know, for those listening, you know, it's an area that's absolutely rife for people to make really important contributions to and get involved in. And there are mechanisms for that. So contact some of us, search the IUCN Climate Change Specialist Group, and hopefully we'll have a better answer to that at least I will in a few years' time.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting kind of contrast. You know, if one is an expert on, you know, the amphibians of Southeast Asia or whatever, how much is one able to get a, you know, range-wide, region-wide, fauna-wide view and, you know, be a useful and helpful expert in those assessments, versus how much are the data able to inform across that region and deeply enough the way that the expert could. I don't know the answer, but I think it's an interesting contrast in very, very different approaches. So Julian Velasco in Mexico is asking, is there any free alternative to the Ramas software? Ramas looks like it's very expensive.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Ramas is something we've used, particularly in collaboration with Ashikaya, who was behind a lot of the development of Ramas. It's very powerful, so it has a lot going for it. It's industry standard in many ways, but you're absolutely right. It is proprietary software, and that is not how we usually like to work, and we're exploring using Ramas, but also other methods that are out there. So there are a whole suite of different methods that have sprung up and been published that I would say you can have a look at, particularly R scripts. So there are R tools in R that you could explore. I'm not going to try to name drop them now, and I will refer you to a really nice review that was in Global Change Biology. Oh, and I'm blanking embarrassingly on the lead author for that. We'll soon find it. We can maybe tweet it out or something. But there's, Tanya, you might remember, there's a very nice paper anyway, Global Change Biology, I think last year, a review of different methods that contrasted and compared a suite of different methods, most of which, at least some of which, probably all of which are freely available. So yes, there are methods out there, certainly.
Great. One last question, I believe also from Angela in Mexico, although from a different account. She asks, have you compared the results of traditional species distribution models versus the approach of species distribution models combined with demographic models? Does the extinction risk of species change significantly?
Between going from, yeah, kind of classic SDM to an SDM with demographic models. So in a broad picture from what we have done so far, which is only, I hesitate to generalize from, that the ballpark extinction risks that we were coming up with haven't been terribly different to what's kind of out there in the literature, but that's a very broad brush, you know, comparing our 25 to 30% for amphibians and reptiles in North America to the broad. I'm a risk professional, and I'm committed to my career.
Sorry about that.
All right, that were put out by, you know, a paper in the IPCC reports or paper like Chris Thomas's classic 2004 paper. But more specifically, I guess I won't try to summarize the details now, but I'll refer you to a paper that Damien Fordham put out, again in Global Change Biology, 2 or 3 years ago. I could probably find the title and we can tweet that out. But that was a study that took particular groups and exactly tried to ask the question that you have. So I'd refer you to that paper and won't try to summarize off the top of my head right now. But what we can do is maybe tweet out that paper as well as a good starting point for trying to answer that particular question.
Great.
What I will say definitely is that there's loads of work to be done on these kinds of questions. You know, this is a field where there's any number of case studies that we'd like to, you know, there's one case study with the Fordham et al. Paper that we'll tweet out, but more generally, we need more studies that ask these kinds of questions in a good, robust way with good data sets, well-implemented models to ask, you know, how does this change our current perception of what, say, extinction risk is?
Okay, can you deal with 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay, so Monica Kaushik, who is in New Delhi in India, asks if I'm interested in teasing apart the role of environmental versus land use variables on species distributions across geographic scales, then how do you decide on the scale? I assume she's meaning resolution.
Oh, good question. Probably one that could generate a lot of discussion. I guess my initial reaction to that would be not to think about trying to define what the scale should be. Really, what would be really interesting, and from the context of what we've just talked about with Eltonian noise hypothesis and the like, what would be interesting would be to test that across a range of different spatial resolutions if you have the data to do that. So don't try and pick the right resolution. Try and ask if that changes or if your results are robust to the resolution you choose.
I think I would agree, but I would throw in the caveat of don't interpret occurrence data at resolutions finer than their precision, which is a very common mistake in the field. One last question for you, Richard. Jay Bancroft asks, What is your opinion about lack of field abundance estimates or filling in by using lab-derived climatic tolerances?
Oh gosh, what I will say is that what we don't have, what we've got, I think GBIF and that, we've got a ton of occurrence data now. We have not enough abundance data. Quite where that comes from, how that's generated, probably the questioner knows more than me. I don't know, but the more that we can get abundance data is, the more that we can get is absolutely vital. And I'll, one of the links, one of the weak links, if you like, in what I presented, and I tried to refer to it, was this assumption that we did make, that we took the occurrence data, we ran a distribution model, and we interpreted what came out as telling us something about carrying capacity or habitat suitability, which we can talk about papers that have come out that have said that's a good assumption and others that have come out saying that's a poor assumption. And yeah, I don't know, we had to make that assumption, but the more we can get occurrence data to actually parameterize these models and test these kinds of assumptions, the better. So we need to think biodiversity informatics is more than occurrence records, it's abundance data and everything we can get.
Great. Richard, thank you so much for a piece of your afternoon. The number of questions reflects the interest that you generated, so thanks very, very much.
Pleasure. Thanks to everybody for listening in and contributing.
And to the broader audience, again, Octavio Rojas will be speaking in early May on taxonomic units and their role in niche and distribution models. So Richard, thanks once again, and good day, good afternoon, or good morning to everybody, depending on where you are in the world.